If you were an upper or middle class lady living in the late Victorian or early Edwardian era, then one book among others was the book to own. The works of Mrs. Beeton and her household management are outdated by today's standards. The wife was second in command of the household next to the husband and was expected to run the household with precision and cleanliness. But while this book was, and still is, being consulted as one of the best cookery books ever published, its instructions on household management give us a moderate view of how women were perceived at this time. In 1913, for the majority of women that were in the lower classes, life would have been rough. If women were working, these were unskilled, low-paid jobs, working long hours, usually in the mills or working the coal tips. The government had brought in laws making it mandatory for children to go to school, but would only support them for free until the age of 13. Even then, the lessons the children had were based on their gender. Girls learnt domestic science, where they were taught to wash and cook, while the boys were given a more broader education so that they were prepared, if they wished, to go on to many different fields. By the age of 13, if the children were not lucky enough to get a free place at the local grammar school, or they couldn't afford it, many of them set out for work. Still, if the family thought it worthless to send their child to school and the money from the wages were needed, it was common for families to offer their children to the workplace as half-timers, with the factory owners making the kids work almost 33 hours a week on top of their normal schooling. But the turn of the 1900s brought a first true inkling of liberation for women. The suffragette movement was founded in 1903, advocating equal rights for women and the right to vote. Following on from several other countries that had already granted this, and as previous movements were less than successful, Emily Pankhurst, the leader of the movement, quoted that they must act with deeds, not words. It was an era of unrest right up until 1914. Few could ignore the rumblings that year from Europe. The Germans were on the advance and were marching through Belgium towards France. The Prime Minister gave Germany an ultimatum: withdraw from Belgium by 11 p.m. on the 3rd of August 1914, otherwise the UK will declare war. Of course, the warning went unheeded, and the announcement was made later that evening. The suffragette movement was suspended overnight. There was more pressing matters, and the women were asking how they could support the nation's cause. The government, meanwhile, had over 750,000 men join up voluntarily for Citizens' Army programme, and the women urged their husbands to flock to the cause. The force would include thousands of railway workers. By the end of 1914, over 8% of the male-dominant workforce had left to go to war, leaving a massive deficit. As railways were key for the war effort, the lack of personnel was a huge problem. So in March 1915, the Railway Executive Committee, who had taken over the railways running collectively, decided that any non-essential or skilled jobs would be offered to women. Prior to the First World War, around 13,000 women were employed by railway companies, mostly employed as secretaries and clerks. But this new ruling would open the floodgates. Women, who had previously fought for equality, now saw this move as a golden opportunity, not only to improve their own social and equality standing, but to make a real conscious contribution to the war effort. The plan started in August 1915, and nearly 14,000 more women signed up to the cause almost straight away. The women would help run the stations as porters, but they also took on more dirtier jobs such as engine cleaning and help with maintenance. Occasionally, the women would be able to work up, and some were even considered for more operational roles such as setting points and helping to maintain tracks. As the women moved from the office to the tracks, there was still one thing stopping them working effectively: their dresses. In an almost unheard of move, the dresses were cast aside for men's breeches. Other workers followed suit. While some call it immodest, practicality won out. Opposition to the women were fierce. The remaining workforce were aghast that these untrained women were coming in by the droves. Some workers went out of their way to prevent the women from being trained. Some women were harshly treated, and what we would consider harassment today was just the norm for the female railway worker, even as far as publishing things in the papers. It seems very odd today, but it was assumed by some men that women were too weak and too fragile, both mentally and physically, to cope with the stresses of railway work. It was also thought that they would not be able to cope with stress or be able to think laterally and problem solve. The railway unions were so concerned that they threatened to take their men off the rails altogether, but the claims were unfounded. Even the unions knew a strike during wartime while men were dying on the front was nothing short of cruel. In almost all circumstances, the women were paid an average 2/3 less for the same work, only increasing marginally if the work was operational and dangerous. If the women were married or got pregnant, then they were expected to resign in order to pursue domestic duties, and they were told, even as they signed up, that this movement was not a permanent one. Once the men were back, the women were expected to go back home and assume their homely duties as soon as possible. So the women remained, and to the men's surprise, even despite the lack of training and constant bullying, the women proved to be competent and dependable workers. They proved that they were everything the men thought they weren't. Some were lucky to even be promoted to more operational roles, such as plate layers, signallers, shunters and guards. Although the fact that some found that knowing a woman was in charge of their train rather unsettling. But still, by the closing of the war, over 100,000 women had joined the railway ranks, and over 1.6 million women were working men's roles in various ways up and down the country. But the end of the war brought back the thousands abroad. Sadly, many didn't make it, and some would never work again, but the majority came back expecting their old jobs to be returned. Many women knew their position and left, giving way to the returning. But a few actually remained in their posts. Over 35,000 vacant postings were left after the war, with some being filled by women. The work the women did all over the country strengthened their case for equality, and thanks to their effort, a number of laws were passed. This ranged from being allowed to be involved in politics for the first time to basic rights over property and divorce, each one boosting women's rights in society. The interwar years would see up to 25% of women back in domestic service, but many would view women rather differently as capable workers even in the most toughest of jobs.